Welcome to the Governance Podcast at the Center for the Study of Governance in Society here at King's College London. My name is Dr. Steven Klein, and I'm a lecturer in political theory here at the Department of Political Economy. And we're very pleased to welcome Ian Shapiro to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you for being here. So Ian Shapiro is the Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale University. He's written widely and influentially on democracy, justice, and the methods of social inquiry. And his latest work concerns the relationship between democracy and the distribution of income and wealth. And thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
I'm very pleased to be here.
So great. I wanted to begin with your 2018 book, actually, on responsible parties, How to Save Democracy from Itself, which you co-authored with Francis McCall Rosenbluth. And this book is a spirited defense of the importance of parties for democracy. And so before we get into some of my questions about your argument, I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about why you think political parties are so vital for democracy, as well as why you think their value tends to be overlooked or you could say neglected in both popular debates around democracy.
Sure. So political parties are important in democracies for two principal reasons. One is that they are the basic instruments of democratic governance, and they're also the instruments of accountability of politicians to voters. And, Schatzsnyder famously said in the 1950s that the condition of a democracy should be read off from the condition of the political parties. Of course, in recent years, we've seen a huge move toward trying to have democracy without parties, or to weaken parties, or to replace them with various forms of direct democracy. But in our judgment, that is basically deleterious to democratic accountability and to effective democratic governance. I can just give you one example, if you like, to make the point. So if you ask American voters, would you like a tax cut? Any tax cut, even getting rid of the estate tax, which is a tax on estates of more than $20 million that almost nobody pays, the most progressive tax in the US tax code, a majority of voters will say yes. If you say to them, would you like a tax cut if getting rid of that tax also means getting rid of free prescription drug benefits for senior citizens, say, then they'll say no. So what's going on there is that in the second instance, voters are discounting their preference for the tax cut with their preference for keeping the free prescription drugs. So that's what parties do. They bundle issues together into platforms, discounting everything they propose by everything else they propose in ways that they hope will appeal to wide numbers of voters, broadest possible number of voters. And if they get it right, they win. If they get it wrong, they lose. So in a two-party system, it's winner-take-all politics, so loser-lose-all politics. So you have to try and do that bundling in a way that'll appeal to a lot of voters. If you allow lots of direct democracy, as we had starting with the anti-tax movement here in 1978, where in California, there was something called Proposition 13, which limited property taxes to 1% of the assessed value of property. So the whole anti-tax crowd came out and voted for that. And that passed by 2/3, but of course they weren't doing the sort of discounting I was just talking about. So they weren't thinking about the implications of that for the costs of local government, for education, for all sorts of things that if they were forced to confront the costs of what they were doing, they would think about differently. And so that was the beginning of the anti-tax movement. Greatly weakens parties when intense voters with an intense preference can pull out something like that and enact it. And I think a similar story could be told about Brexit in the UK. And so although it looks more democratic, you say, well, we'll vote issue by issue. We have internet. We can have, active citizen participation. In fact, it's an illusion, because what it really does is make it possible for powerful interests to essentially hijack the political party process and get what they want.
I have a follow-up question about that, but I wanted to also, maybe just so people know the full argument, ask you about something else, which is, so, this is a question of sort of democracy bypassing parties altogether. But another issue you deal with in the book is debates about democratizing political parties themselves. So a lot of people say, look, political parties are necessary evils, or they have these positive effects, but they can also lead to kind of capture by elites within the party. And so what we need is kind of good democracy within the parties. And you also are in the book are very skeptical of that. So before I get into some more critical or some questions, maybe you could also just say a little bit about your worry about democratizing political parties themselves.
Right. So competition is the lifeblood of democracy, but we argue that inter-party competition is good and intra-party competition is bad. And I'll give you two examples of the problems that get generated when you have a lot of intra-party competition. And they both come down to the fact that participants in intra-party competition tend to be on the fringes of the parties. In the US, this plays out in primary elections. So you have, the party members or activists vote heavily in primary elections, but most voters don't vote in primary elections. So the primaries are essentially, what happens is they pull candidates towards extremes of the parties. In the US, this has been made much worse in recent decades because we've got more and more safe seats. So in congressional primaries, more and more of the elections, the primary is the only election that matters because the seat is safe for the party. So once the primary is over, and maybe, then say you get an 11 or 15% turnout, heavily dominated by people on the extremes of the parties. And it happens at the presidential level too. Most people don't know this, but Trump, for example, was selected in 2016 by 5% of the US electorate in very low turnout primaries. You saw an example of this in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, where they went to direct election of the leadership in the Labour Party. He again was the members who are way to the left of the median voter in the Labour Party, never mind the median British voter. The parliamentary Labour Party found they couldn't work with him, and had a 162 to 40 vote of no confidence in him. 3 months later, he was re-elected by the membership, I think with 62%. And so again, you get what looks like a democratic outcome, but in fact, what it enables is takeovers of the parties by members on their extremes, and that limits accountability, limits effectiveness. It makes it very difficult for parties to govern. We argue that's a lot of the explanation for gridlock in the US. And so intra-party democracy sounds good until you drill down and think about, well, who actually participates in intra-party democracy, and how does that affect the capacity of parties to actually govern when they win elections?
Good. I mean, this raises, I think, a really interesting puzzle, which you don't entirely address in the book, which is sort of, if this is so harmful to parties, why do they do it? It seems like there's an interesting question of sort of why are, so you go back to the, the McGovern Commission and the reforms in the Democratic Party after the 68, there's all these moments, it seems like, where parties, in response to some internal conflict, bring in these reforms. Do you have a kind of a view as to why parties do this seemingly irrational, from the perspective of your argument, a kind of irrational thing?
Well, parties are unusual organizational forms in that nobody owns them. People often analogize parties to firms, and Schumpeter famously did that. Parties are like firms, politicians are like, profit-seeking entrepreneurs, and, consumers are like voters, and so on. And people often point out it's a strained analogy, but one of the ways in which it is very strained is that there's no equivalent of shareholders in parties. Nobody owns them. They're unowned entities, and that makes the governance of them inherently contentious. So you often have a lot of fights about governance. And our argument is that starting in the 1970s, as many of the older democracies headed into very difficult economic times, because we had stagflation, we had the oil shocks, we had the aging, the beginning of the age of the baby boomers starting to put more pressure on the fiscal structure of these systems, as you had more and more working age voters supporting, fewer and fewer working age voters supporting more and more retired voters. So there were a lot of reasons that these economies were doing less well, growth was slowing, and people tend to blame the political system. Anthony King wrote a brilliant book about this in the UK called The British Constitution, where he pointed out that some of the big reforms to the British system started in the 70s for exactly these reasons. It was a very tough economic decade. People started blaming the political system. It was almost, like bloodletting, we argue. It was fixing what wasn't broken. But as governments delivered less well, people said, oh, well, there must be something wrong with the parties. And the US, it was all about Vietnam, the angry, the angry generation in the wake of the 1968 Democratic Convention, when the anti-war candidate lost, even though Hubert Humphrey was picked as the candidate, even though the party members didn't want him. And so what tends to happen is you get these sort of decentralizing reforms. Once they're there, they're extremely difficult to undo because people perceive them as more democratic. And so actually, even though they make the parties even more dysfunctional, when that happens, you get demands for even more decentralization. And so sort of pushing in exactly the wrong direction, because unless you have strong parties, they're not able to put together coherent programs and implement them.
Yeah, and this, it sounds very compelling. And I think the one part of the decline that I'm interested in, and one thing that I think is an interesting part of the story, is also the decline of some of the traditional sources of mobilization for political parties. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, I often think of one thing I've often thought about in these debates is that there are two different dimensions to political parties. So one is the coordination function, which is what you really emphasize. So kind of bundling issues together, building those compromises, integrating various interest groups. But parties also exist to get people to vote and to mobilize their constituencies. And it seems, if you look at the debate in the last two primaries in the Democratic Party, in the UK, it seems like one of the big debates is sort of how do you balance this coordination function of trying to find issues that appeal to the median voter with also ensuring that the kind of core constituencies of the party reliably vote. And it seems like one of the real big stories has been the kind of gradual decline of some of these reliable sources of political support, especially for more social democratic and left-wing parties. So how do you think about that sort of aspect, or that tension? Like, could it be part of what political parties are trying to do when they bring in these reforms, is also find ways of activating these voters who have, because of the decline of unions and a lot of these traditional kind of sources of mobilization, they need to figure out how to remobilize some of their constituencies?
So I think you've absolutely nailed the problem. And, you know, the biggest piece of it is the declining power of trade unions, which is in the US has gone on since the 1950s. In almost every European democracy, and the UK has gone on since the 1970s and 80s. And you know, the unions were a major source of mobilization for voters to vote for center-left parties. You know, and that is to some extent, parties are looking for substitutes for that. By the way, this also plays out, and we haven't talked about multi-party systems at all. You know, people, particularly on the left, used to favor multi-party systems because they seem more redistributive and more responsive to labor, to the interests of labor than two-party systems. And that used to be true. You know, one of the things we argue, and we've been exploring in subsequent research subsequent to that book, is it seems like it's no longer true, because you've also had declining unions in all the European systems, and declining power of the left for that reason. And so, you know, center-left parties, social democratic parties that used to come in first or second, whether it's in Germany or Holland or Israel or you name it, now come in fourth or fifth. And so that greatly weakens the power of left of center parties. And the main story in the European systems now is fragmentation of the left, which is also produced alienated voters there. They respond differently than in two-party systems. But you know, that's a big part of the story about the emergence for Alternative for Deutschland, or in Holland or in Austria, and all of these countries of far-right populist parties. So what shows up in the US with primary voters in the Republican Party shows up with these far-right parties. So it's a huge problem in all of these systems that the traditional source of mobilizations for parties on the left has largely disintegrated. But we argue that, you know, further weakening parties is not the solution to that problem.
Yeah, good. And this gets a little bit into the political economy stuff, which you've been thinking about as well. But before, I have one more, I have another question about the political parties things. I think it's such an interesting debate. And I wanted to ask, you know, so it seems like so the book is a defense of parties. And so you obviously are trying to push back against a lot of skepticism towards political parties. And so you, as you've already said, you defend sort of large scale catch-all political parties. I mean, your ideal, it seems to me, is kind of the Westminster British model when it works well, kind of these large catch-all parties who can come into power and govern on their own. You also say some interesting thing about coalition systems and multi-party systems and the value of kind of people knowing beforehand what the coalition is going to look like. But there's a worry, and this is about political parties in general, that I feel like doesn't come through in the book. And it's the worry I associate most with Peter Meyer's work and his book, Ruling the Void, which is that when you have that sort of system, parties also have a very large incentive to take controversial or particularly challenging issues off the political agenda. And so one argument, for example, about Brexit is that for a long time, there's been a kind of simmering tension around the UK's role in the European Union. And both parties have worked very, very hard to take that issue off the table. And similarly, Meyer argues a similar phenomenon in European party systems, where the kind of grand coalition politics, there's a lot of work to take certain issues off the table because the parties have a very strong incentive to sort of figure out what's going to keep them in power, and what's going to keep them in power is often. And so I think like part of, I think, Meyer's argument is that this can also create really challenging dynamics for these political parties, because the more, say, there's a strong consensus, bi-party consensus around something like the European Union, the easier it is for these smaller parties to exploit the openings that are created. Whereas if you had more full-fledged conflict between parties, and so even more polarization, that would reduce this tendency of people to become disaffected. And when you see, you see the same thing in the US, I think. I think one thing I often think about with the Trump, so Trump clearly was a case of, political capture of a party by its base. But one thing I always thought was very interesting, you go back to 2008, Obama promised to renegotiate NAFTA. And so there was a way in which the free trade consensus in the US, there was a kind of bipartisan consensus that was in some ways forged over a lot of tension. And so that created an opportunity for a demagogue to exploit that feeling that people, so what do you say to that worry? That the kind of, so the pathologies of too much democracy are fragmentation, but the pathologies of parties are going to be a sort of incentive to take these issues off the table as much as possible, which can then create openings for populists or other people to exploit that sort of depoliticization.
Well, I think that's partly right, but partly misguided. The part that's right, just to start with your example, it was a mistake of Obama not to renegotiate NAFTA. It was also a mistake of Obama to ignore the people in the Democratic base who were deeply damaged by the aftermath of the financial crisis and spend so many chips bailing out the banks and not attending to the 20+ million people who'd lost their homes and so on. And I think that was a big strategic failure of the Obama administration that set up 2016. But I want to talk about the US all the time. Let's talk about the UK and Brexit, which you also brought up, because I think it illustrates where this logic runs out. So people forget this, but in the 1980s, the Tories were pro-Europe, and Margaret Thatcher was pro-European, pro-Europe. But there were still plenty of Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party, and she had, what you might think of Brexit people before Brexit who were saying, British workers are getting screwed, this is really bad. And how did she respond to it? If you look at what she ran on in 1983, it was essentially going to renegotiate the deal with Europe, which she did, and that's where the 40 billion pound rebate came from. She won on that. She ran on that, she did it, she won, she did it. And then that took a lot of the wind out of the sails of the Brexiteers. So she essentially, to use the jargon of economists, she priced in their concerns to the way in which she was doing the bundling that I was talking about right at the beginning of our conversation. And essentially, that kept the party together, but it took account of some of the concerns of those people, and it didn't stop the Tories, winning multiple elections after that. So it's not that the party took the Eurosceptics' concerns off the table. They incorporated them, but they said then they're not the only issue that matters. And so, yes, we need to redo this deal so that it's better for Britain. Now, if you look at Brexit itself, and fast forward to the 2000s, one of the arguments for the referendum was both the parties are overwhelmingly pro-Europe. And so pro-Remain. And so what about the people who don't want to be in Europe? They have no party to vote for, right? That's the way the issue was framed. But of course, if you have a referendum, you're engaging in the unbundling that we talked about at the beginning, right? Because when you say, do you want to leave Europe? People are saying, well, do I want nasty European bureaucrats doing messing around with my life, or do I want Polish plumbers taking jobs, whatever it is? And they're not forced to discount their preference for less control from Europe by their other preferences. And so, the telling statistics are that not only in 2015 did Parliament elect overwhelmingly pro-European parties, but so they did in 2017. So, right? So instead of, it's the wrong to say, well, where did the Brexit voters go? That's the wrong question to ask. The question to ask is, well, why is it that both parties are electing to Parliament delegations that are pro-European? And the answer was that most MPs in both parties knew that, half of Britain's trade was with Europe, that this wasn't going to be good for most of their constituents. And when they bundled it, they came out somewhere else. Then I think what happened was because of the weakening in the parties, you had entryism and all that. And so essentially, Farage and the Brexiteers were able to hijack the Tory party pretty much in the sort of way that the hijacking occurred in the US of the Republican Party. And again, it was a failure of the Tories to behave the way Thatcher had behaved in the 1980s, and Cameron's attempt to renegotiate the deal with Europe before the referendum was pathetic, and so his bluff got called. But I think another way just to drive home the point is, I thought it was the most revealing thing that happened during Theresa May's leadership was, not only could she not get Parliament to approve the deal her Brexit deal, she couldn't get them to approve any alternative to it, and she couldn't get them to even to approve asking for more time. And so, that just underscores the artificiality of the choice, because in the referendum, it included right-wing Tories who what do they want? They want Singapore on the Thames. And left-wing people from the Labour Party, what do they want? They want socialism in one country. So there's no agreement on what they want as an alternative to being in Europe. And so this is what happens if you create a completely artificial choice and frame it in this way for voters. It's not actually a coherent, they're not choosing between two even intelligible alternatives, because so I think that is the cost of unbundling issues.
It's really interesting because, I'm probably slightly more sympathetic to referendums than you, because there's an interesting, I think, democratic theory puzzle that comes in. So if it's a basic constitutional issue, what other mechanism is there for kind of, say, altering the base? So for example, I'm actually from Vancouver, Canada originally, and we've had a series of referendums on electoral reform, which you're probably familiar with, coming out of the BC Citizens Assembly, which a lot of political scientists were heavily involved in. And I think you see similar pathologies there. But on the other hand, it seems like, in the same way there might not be alternatives to political parties in some circumstances, when you're dealing with these more basic constitutional questions, I wonder if you think there could be a way that a kind of better designed referendum could have served better, say a two-stage referendum, because it's also worth knowing that there was a referendum for the UK to join the European Union. And so there is a kind of, you could say, precedent that if it's a question that has to do with the basic constitutional structure of the UK, which membership in the European Union is a question of basic constitutional structure. It's not a policy like healthcare where you can sort of adjust it up or down. I mean, it's about, do you accept the supremacy of European law? Do you accept the direct effect of that law? I mean, these are kind of very basic questions. I think, this is where things get puzzling, because how do you resolve those constitutional issues through political parties that have to operate within a constituted political system?
Well, so I disagree with that. I mean, first of all, again, it was a completely artificial choice, the supremacy of European law, because now Britain is going to trade with Europe governed by laws that they were governed by before. It's just they're not going to have a say in making them that they used to have. So actually in a worse position. But go back, you mentioned the 1975 referendum. I think it's a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. Britain had never had a referendum before then, ever, at the national level. Why did Harold Wilson call that referendum? You know, Britain had joined the common market a few years earlier under Heath without a referendum. Heath had been the big pro-European. And in those days, it was Labour who was more Eurosceptical, mainly because there were, at that time, weaker protections for Labour in Europe than they were in the UK. That's why the Tories wanted it. They thought it would force, you know, more competitive economics onto the British economy, and that would be good for Labour. And that's exactly why the left wing of the Labour Party didn't want to be in Europe. You know, now it's all flipped, but that's what's the story then. And Wilson didn't want to have that fight in the Labour Party. And so he thought, how do I take this fight off the table? We'll hold a referendum. And he held a referendum, and 2/3 voted to remain. And he crowed afterwards that, you know, this has solved this issue forever. And first of all, as we know, it didn't solve the issue forever. Secondly, it didn't even stop the fragmentation of the Labour Party over this issue, you know, because, you know, 5 years later, when Foot and Benn were, you know, ascendant because of the internal democracy, they said, well, we're going to leave Europe without another referendum. And that produced a huge fight, which led Shirley Williams and others to storm out and create the Social Democratic Party. Yeah. So, you know, Wilson didn't even achieve his goal of avoiding having this fight within the Labour Party, which, you know, a much smarter move would have been to do the mirror image of what Thatcher would do in the next decade. A much smarter move would have been for him to, you know, grasp the issue and say, well, you know, we want better protections for Labour in the European Union. And they would have become the vanguard for spearheading the rewriting of the social chapter and, you know, things that happened anyway later, you know, actually, because of pressure from left of center parties within European countries.
Yeah. France and Italy, yeah.
So, you know, I think it was a disastrous decision by Harold Wilson to just sort of duck that issue rather than see, you know, the better way would have been to do what I just said. Actually
resolve it politically rather than slough it out on a referendum.
That there was a big constituency of the Labour Party that was angry about Europe because they saw it as threatening protections for workers, and go and renegotiate that.
Great, yeah, and actually this brings us back to the thing you said earlier, that this kind of early 70s movement is such a crucial turning point. And, you know, one thing you talked about in your lecture here at the center, and that is the theme of your new book, is a lot of these changes in the party system are being driven by larger structural changes in the political economy of advanced capitalist societies. So you have another book that just came out this year, The Wolf at the Door, The Menace of Economic Insecurity and How to Fight It, which is co-authored with Michael Greats. And so I also want to make sure we talk about this other facet of what you've been working on, which is to situate these political changes within a larger story about the changing structure of political economy. So you could say, you already mentioned this a little bit, but say a little bit more sort of about how these two, the arguments of the two books connect with each other.
The basic fact that is the most consequential fact of our time, I think, is the disappearance of long-term employment security for vast majorities of workers all over the world, but in the older democracies, since that's what we're talking about. So the era when you finished your education, whether high school or university as well, and then worked at a job for 30 years and then retired, that's just gone. People entering the labor market now should expect to change jobs 12 to 15 times. And the jobs that used to be going to trade are now going to technology. All this is being accelerated by COVID because the technology is getting so much better. But you know, the McDonald's in which there used to be 20 people working and then now 6 people working, 5 years from now, there'll be one person watching a robot make hamburgers. And it's not just at the bottom end of the income distribution, it is more and more middle-class jobs are also going to technology, and that's only going to accelerate. So you know, David Autor and others have argued this doesn't mean jobs are going away. People have been saying that forever. When you know, there'll be all kinds of new industries, but this means you've got to have a very different set of responses to unemployment, to retraining, to perpetual re-education of people who have lost their jobs than most of these countries have. Certainly the US and the UK, although the US is worse. And that is the insecurity that populists exploit. And that's the insecurity the Obama administration completely missed and didn't address at all. For example, you know, and if it happens with Biden, we'll have another Trump. We'll, you know, there's no question about it. So that is the, you know, long-term employment insecurity is the basic fact of our time. And it doesn't matter to people on the right side of the information revolution. I think this is why the elites didn't see it as a big problem. You know, if you're, you know, if you are, you know, you come out of university and you go through a few startups and then maybe you go to business school, those people are fine. They're building up, you know, nest eggs on 401ks, as we call them here. So for them, changing jobs is just an opportunity to do something new and exciting thing and make more money. But they're the minority. And for most people, they're basically bouncing down the socioeconomic scale. They're moving from more secure to less secure jobs. They're moving from jobs with good benefits to worse benefits to no benefits. They're moving from jobs that are of higher status to lower status. They are angry, they are afraid, they're disaffected. That is the natural constituency now for parties of the left. And if they don't address their needs, we're going to get people pushing, you know, one snake oil remedy after another, promising to bring up jobs that aren't going to come back, engaging in protectionism, which doesn't work. So that my book with Michael Gratz is about policies to address those problems. We also argue, particularly in light of the collapse of labor as a political force, that it's very much in the interest of business to get behind these reforms, because otherwise they're going to wind up, we're going to wind up with governments that are going to do a lot of things business doesn't like. They don't like protectionism. They don't like all this xenophobic politics. You know, they don't want a lot of these politics, but that's what we're going to get. And so a big part of our argument is actually aimed at business elites to show, you know, just as business elites in the 30s were much friendlier to the New Deal than many people realize in the US. Business elites have to start to see it as in their interest to get behind policies to address that.
Great. Yeah, and I think, you know, this is something you mentioned earlier, but it's also why to kind of reiterate, you know, there's a twofold, there's the insecurity, and then there's also the decline of the institutions, not only that would buffer some of that insecurity, like labor unions who maybe could negotiate. So you look at countries that have historically stronger labor unions, they're often able to negotiate the implementation of technology to buffer some of the kind of technology shocks. But then you also, those are this, you know, you have a lot of very disaffected people who, it just seems to me, have a kind of justified or understandable, maybe not justified, understandable just distrust and distaste of politics in general. So there's a kind of anti-political sentiment that they have, because they don't have these institutions that can connect them with political parties and make them feel like their voice is being represented in the political parties, and is a kind of information conduit between these grassroots and the political elites. And I think this is where it all comes full circle, where then you get the elites trying to figure out how to re-engage those people, and they don't have a lot of tools because they don't have these other institutions to work with to engage with those grassroots people.
And the parties are now so weak that it's very difficult for the elites to actually deliver these kinds of policies. You know,
Yeah.
Biden's probably going to be hamstrung because the odds of them actually getting the Senate are low, and even if they did, if they're the good number of centrist Democratic senators who are vulnerable to primary challenges in southern states. So enacting a kind of, say, the equivalent of what the Attlee government did in the 1940s, aimed at our time, or what Lyndon Johnson did in 1964 with the Great Society, today is much harder because the parties are weaker. And so it's a real institutional challenge. And as I said, you've got to think about the political economy. That's partly why my book with Gratz is aimed in significant part at business elites, showing, because unless some of the players who, can eat, what are the business elites been trying to do? They've been pushing for tax cuts, the Trump 2017 tax bill, just a massive giveaway to business. They don't see, they're cutting off their nose to spite their face. It would have been much better for them to get behind policies that would actually help working class voters.
Can I ask, so can you say a little bit more about what policies you're calling for specifically in the book? So what is your pitch to these business elites in terms of what would be their kind of top priority in, highest, let's talk their language, highest return on investment programs that you and Gates, your organization, support?
So what we argue is for something called universal adjustment insurance, which is universal adjustment assistance, which would replace the rather pathetic trade adjustment assistance laws that most of these countries have. And, these were enacted partly to get labor to support free trade, that, if workers who lost their jobs to trade would get assistance retraining. But they're all pretty small, poorly administered, not very good programs. And so we argue for a much more ambitious system that would replace existing unemployment insurance with, which is particularly bad in the US because it's 50 state systems with, ad hoc federal add-ons when the sort of situation like we're in now. But it's not very good in most European countries. Like Denmark has a much better system than most. But basically what's needed is decoupling basic economic security from the vicissitudes of going in and out of jobs, because that's not going away. And so you need systems that allow people to retrain and retool and move and do whatever they need to go back into the workforce in some way that is going to be economically effective. And it would be desirable for two reasons. One is, what do they do instead? In the US, they go onto Social Security disability insurance. And once they're on that, they never come off. And so somebody in their 40s does that. They don't show up in the unemployment statistics, but that's about the most expensive way to support an unproductive worker. Look at it from the point of view of business elites, it's a complete drag on the system because they're contributing nothing, and it's a net cost, for the next 30 years. Essentially, we're not calling it that, but we're basically just supporting people. And then the other reason is this is a subsidy to business, because a well-trained workforce and an adaptable workforce and a retrainable workforce, that, you know, that is a big subsidy to business. So, you know, the tax system should be subsidizing that, and business should see it as in their interest to get behind that. And so that's the one thing. And then we have other policies, you know, like delinking health insurance from employment for all the same reasons. And we have a way of doing that that wouldn't run into the sticker shock of Medicare for all. Basically, we start with expanding it at the bottom because the younger people are much cheaper to insure, and that would also build a political coalition for it over time. But basically, that's what has to be done, because if you have millions and millions and millions of economically vulnerable and downwardly mobile people, they are going to be afraid and desperate people do desperate things. And that's, you know, that's what happened in the 1930s in European systems. That's how we got fascism in Italy in the 20s and in Germany in the 30s. And, you know, that's where we could be heading again if it's, we've been talking about the US and the UK, but the European systems are facing many similar problems. And we've been, again, since that book, been doing more research. You know, what shows up in the British and American systems as weaker parties, in the European system shows up as fragmentation, as the, you know, as say the Social Democrats they're defending a shrinking labor aristocracy of employed workers. And so they're, you know, but what about the other workers? They're the ones who are hemorrhaging to the Linke, to the Greens, to the AfD, to all of these other parties, and supporting more and more, you know, anti-system candidates and parties. And so then nobody should think that they're immune to this, or that, you know, if only we had multi-party systems, we would be off this hook. They're facing all the same problems.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think we should end on that note. It's an epochal set of questions. I think it's extremely impressive how you're integrating the political and the economic, which is one of the goals of, you know, what we are up to here. And so I just really appreciate hearing your thoughts and having the opportunity to talk to you about some of these big issues. So thanks
for having me. I enjoyed it.